Miles Kessler never planned on becoming a problem for anyone. All he wanted was peace, real, unbothered peace, and space to live how he saw fit. After spending most of his adult life working with conservation groups across the Southwest, managing protected lands and rehabilitating large mammals, he finally decided it was time to settle down somewhere quiet, where he could work on his own terms. He chose a parcel of land tucked against the western hills of Mason County, a sweeping 40-acre stretch that backed up to a public wilderness preserve but was fully titled under his name. The property was rugged but promising, with enough flat ground for corrals and enough shade from the nearby Oak Ridge to make the summers bearable. The best part? The neighbors were far enough away to make small talk optional. When he bought the place, the land had been neglected for years. Fences were down or rotted out, structures had collapsed under their own weight, and invasive weeds had overrun most of the terrain. But Miles didn't mind. He moved into a modular home parked near the southern fence line, powered it with solar panels, and got to work. The plan wasn't complicated. Restore the land using regenerative grazing methods, run a small herd of bison, not for meat or tourism but for ecological balance, and maybe, in time, invite schools or wildlife groups to witness what sustainable land management could look like. Miles believed in letting nature lead, and he trusted the bison more than most people. They were strong, deliberate, and didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. He invested carefully. The fencing came first, robust, timber-posted barriers that traced the property line, blending with the environment rather than cutting it off. He sourced untreated wood from a family mill in Colorado and used wildlife-friendly wire that allowed deer and smaller creatures to pass beneath, but held his herd in safely. The fence was more than protection. It was a message. This land is being cared for, and it matters. But within 3 months of the last post being set, that message was answered not with curiosity or support, but hostility. It began with a letter, not from the county, not from any legal agency, but from the board of a neighborhood association operating adjacent to his land. Though Miles' property wasn't part of any subdivision, the letter, stiffly worded and printed on thick cream-colored stock, asserted that his newly installed fencing obstructed shared visual corridors and violated the aesthetic expectations of the surrounding community. It was signed by a woman named Karen Wilmore, the association's chairperson, and stated that fines would be levied if he did not take corrective action within 30 days. Miles reread it twice, then looked out the window of his small office trailer toward the fence line. On the other side of the trees, barely visible from his property, sat a community park. Flat land, landscaped, and almost always empty, save for a few joggers and dog walkers. He didn't respond to the letter. Instead, he checked with the county registrar to confirm that his property was entirely outside of any jurisdiction governed by the association. It was. He then called the association's listed number, not to argue, but to politely inform them that their reach didn't extend to his land. No one answered, so he left a voicemail. A few days later, he received a second letter, less formal but more direct in tone. It accused him of being deliberately uncooperative and warned that the association would seek municipal support if continued non-compliance persisted. There was no reference to any legal basis, no citations of zoning violations, only vague threats of involvement from community partners. That's when he realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. In the weeks that followed, things escalated subtly, then aggressively. A landscaping crew from the adjacent neighborhood drove across the edge of his land to access utility lines, leaving deep ruts near his watering station. When Miles confronted the crew, they simply shrugged and said they were told the road was shared. Later, an orange notice was taped to one of his fence posts, declaring the structure pending review by the Neighborhood Aesthetic Committee. It was absurd. There was no committee with authority over his property, and yet they acted as though there was. What disturbed him more than the bureaucratic arrogance was the casual assumption that he would roll over, as if he were a new transplant, unaware of how things worked out here. As if being quiet and keeping to himself made him an easy target. He wasn't. Miles had lived through bureaucracy before. He'd worked with state parks, tribal governments, and federal agencies. He'd drafted land management plans and defended them in public hearings. He knew what jurisdiction meant, and, more importantly, he knew when someone was bluffing. The board, this Karen woman and whoever propped her up, didn't have the authority they pretended to, but they were counting on the fact that no one would challenge them. They were playing a game of pressure and optics, not law. So Miles did what he always did when pushed. He made everything official. He documented every interaction. He photographed the property lines. He registered his grazing operation as an educational nonprofit. He filed a land use affidavit with the county stating the fence's purpose and confirmed in writing that no shared easements existed with the adjacent neighborhood. Then he went back to work, replacing a broken gate, planting drought-tolerant grass along the southern edge, and helping one of his cows give birth to a shaggy, knock-kneed calf. But it didn't end there. People began walking the trails behind the playground more frequently, lingering longer at the fence, pointing toward the animals. One man even shouted at him across the property line, "You're not special just 'cause you've got some cows. Don't expect us to put up with it." Another woman filed a complaint to animal control claiming the bison were agitated and aggressive because they grunted when she walked by with her dog. Animal control arrived, saw nothing out of order, and left with apologies. But the implication remained. Miles wasn't just being opposed, he was being framed as a threat. What struck him most was the hypocrisy. The same people who praised conservation efforts when they happened in documentaries or across the globe now recoiled when nature moved next door. The same families who posted about respecting wildlife called him a nuisance because they didn't like the way his fence looked through their picnic area. They wanted the illusion of wilderness, not the responsibility of living beside it. And they certainly didn't want someone like Miles, a quiet man, self-directed, uninterested in suburban etiquette, reminding them that the land was never theirs to curate. He thought often of tearing the whole thing down. Not the fence, but the illusion that had allowed it all. The idea that appearances mattered more than outcomes, that a polished lawn was worth more than a working pasture. But he knew better. The fight wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't even about land. It was about who got to define what counted as acceptable, and what happened when someone refused to play along. Miles wasn't angry. He was focused. And focus, he knew from experience, could be dangerous when directed at the right target. Because if they thought a fence was the problem, they hadn't seen what came after. The letter that arrived in early May wasn't from the association. It was from the county. Unlike the previous passive-aggressive correspondences, this one was stamped, logged, and sent through the proper municipal office. It cited a zoning violation. Specifically, it claimed that Miles's perimeter fencing obstructed a designated shared recreational corridor connecting the neighboring park to the trail system within the municipal nature preserve. The complaint wasn't written by a zoning officer, but by a local planning consultant working on behalf of concerned community stakeholders. There was no specific mention of the association, but Miles could practically smell Karen's perfume on the pages. The violation notice came with a directive. Either apply for a zoning variance and submit detailed site plans, or remove the fence section within 15 business days. Non-compliance would lead to escalating daily fines and a possible enforcement order. The threat of fines wasn't what bothered Miles. What gnawed at him was the language used. Shared recreational corridor was an invention. There was no legal record of an easement, no public trail mapped through his property, and no historical pathway recognized by the county. But the use of the word shared suggested something already claimed, an assertion wrapped in bureaucratic politeness that masked its aggressiveness. Miles called his attorney, Anita Feldman, a land use specialist who'd handled several grazing rights disputes for ranchers upstate. Calm and surgical in her assessments, she reviewed the documents within the hour. Her response was terse. "They're trying to push you into a variance so they can set precedent. You don't apply. You don't acknowledge. You respond with a demand for documentation of any legally recorded access agreement." That same day, she filed a public records request and sent a letter to the planning consultant challenging the basis for the complaint and demanding a withdrawal of the violation notice within 10 days unless proper legal substantiation could be provided. Miles felt steadier knowing she was in his corner, but the move made him aware that this wasn't going away with words. A day later, a pair of the county compliance officers drove up the gravel path to his gate. They didn't enter the property, but they stood at the line and took photographs, pointing and marking things on clipboards. Miles stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. One of them waved and said they were just verifying for documentation. He didn't answer, just nodded and watched them leave. That night, he installed a trail camera facing the same area. 2 days later, he woke to find the northern gate ajar. Not wide open, just enough for something, or someone, to slip through. The latch hadn't been broken, but the pin had been removed and tossed into the grass several yards away. It was subtle, almost too subtle as if whoever had done it wanted plausible deniability. Miles checked the footage. The camera caught only motion from a high wind, and a blurry shape passing too quickly to identify. But it was enough to confirm one thing. Someone had stepped foot on his land without consent. He reported the tampering to the sheriff's office, but the deputy who showed up seemed disinterested. No clear damage, no sign of forced entry, and no suspect. He advised Miles to keep the gate locked and call back if anything else happened. The advice was worthless, but Miles kept his cool. That weekend, Karen Wilmore appeared again, not in person but in the local circular. She had written a community reflection piece, praising efforts to preserve accessibility and continuity in outdoor spaces and warning against privatization that disrupts shared environmental experiences. The language was careful, but the implication was direct. The problem was him. Miles laughed when he read it, not because it was funny, but because of the desperation hidden beneath the passive civility. She didn't have a legal foot to stand on, so she was building a narrative. He could see it unfolding in real time. First the complaints, then the escalation, and now the attempt to sway public opinion. The most galling part? She framed herself as the defender of nature, someone fighting against a selfish landowner who'd closed off the landscape with unnecessary barriers. The next escalation came swiftly. One of his heifers, a younger cow, not a part of the core Bison group, was found injured near the fence. Her rear flank had a shallow laceration that looked too clean to be from brush or barbed wire. Miles called his veterinarian, who treated the wound and confirmed his suspicion. It had been cut, not torn, possibly from wire snips or a blade. The vet didn't press further, just warned Miles to keep his herd away from the fence line for a while. Miles moved them to the southern paddock and added another trail camera, this one camouflaged and positioned for wider coverage. He didn't say anything publicly. He didn't accuse, but the silence was a mask for the churn just beneath the surface. Anita pushed harder. She requested a formal hearing with the county and challenged the very premise of the notice, using plat maps, zoning overlays, and historical surveys. In her letter, she detailed the lack of any easement, pointed to the association's overreach, and demanded the immediate nullification of any pending penalties. Her language was dry but venomous. Karen didn't respond directly, but her allies did. Over the course of the next week, 5 anonymous complaints were filed to various agencies: state wildlife, animal control, water use, and fire services. All against Miles. They claimed improper livestock enclosures, possible water diversion violations, environmental hazard risks, and even unlicensed fire mitigation activity. Each agency showed up separately, one with a clipboard, one with a drone, one with a camera crew. Most left within minutes, realizing the reports were bogus. One agent from State Wildlife actually apologized and said, off the record, "Someone really doesn't want you here." Miles didn't rage. He kept his head down and added the visits to his folder. Every badge number, every timestamp, every odd detail went into a growing digital log. Anita started preparing a secondary defense file. Less legal, more tactical. "This is coordinated," she told him, "and it's getting expensive. But the longer we hold, the more desperate they'll get." The desperation showed its face one foggy Thursday morning. Miles was loading feed when he noticed one of the calves staring off toward the tree line. Alert, ears perked. He followed the calf's gaze and saw movement behind the oaks. Human. He couldn't make out the figure, but the rustle of leaves and the sound of a plastic container snapping closed told him what he needed to know. When he got to the spot, he found the remains of what looked like a bait pile. Bread, fruit scraps, and something unidentifiable mixed in. He collected the evidence and bagged it. Later, a lab confirmed trace amounts of meloxicam, a drug safe for pets but potentially dangerous to large ungulates if consumed in quantity. That night, he stood by the northern fence, watching the horizon melt into dusk. He didn't feel fear. What he felt was tightening focus, like his senses were shedding everything unnecessary. He wasn't going to retaliate, not yet. He was going to wait, collect, and calculate. Let them believe he was just a rancher with a few animals and a bit of land. Let them keep pushing. Because sooner or later they would overstep, and when they did, he would no longer be the one under scrutiny. They would be. The next incident wasn't dramatic at first glance. In fact, it looked more like a petty nuisance than a deliberate escalation. Miles returned from a brief supply run into town to find that one section of his western fence, about 20 feet along the ridgeline, had been dismantled. Not torn down or destroyed, but carefully taken apart. The posts stacked neatly in a pile beside the boundary line, and the wire coiled and left hanging like some kind of offering. At first, it seemed absurd. Why would anyone go through the trouble of removing a portion of fencing with such care, unless they wanted to make a point without being accused of outright vandalism? It was an open statement disguised as ambiguity, the kind of provocation that dared him to respond emotionally. But Miles didn't take the bait. He photographed the scene from multiple angles, documented the missing section, and filed an incident report with the sheriff's department. The deputy who responded was the same one who'd brushed him off weeks earlier, but this time he looked uneasy, especially after Miles mentioned the drugged bait and previous injuries. "I'll make a note of it," the deputy said, which Miles knew meant almost nothing, but at least it was a record. He replaced the fencing himself, deliberately using a different style of post for that section so the alteration would stand out. Anyone returning would know it had been noticed, and, more importantly, that he was watching. 2 days later, Karen Wilmore herself made an appearance. She didn't come to the gate or request a meeting. Instead, she positioned herself just outside the edge of his property during one of her morning nature walks, standing near the community playground that bordered his land and watching the animals. She wore a windbreaker in soft pastel colors and oversized sunglasses, sipping from a stainless steel thermos like any retiree out for fresh air. But her posture was deliberate. Arms crossed, weight forward, gaze fixed on the fence line. When Miles stepped into view from behind the barn, she smiled, waved casually, and continued her silent observation. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. It was theater, a performance for anyone else who might be walking by. That was the danger of people like her. She didn't attack head-on. She undermined, calculated, waited for optics to tilt in her favor. Miles didn't approach. He simply noted the time, date, and location in his logbook, then went back to work. But the effect lingered, like a smell that wouldn't wash off. She wanted him to feel watched, to feel the presence of pressure without any overt confrontation. It was control by insinuation, and she was good at it. Later that week, a notice appeared on the county bulletin board stating that a review of public access rights around the perimeter of the municipal green space was underway. The wording was generic, but the implications were not. Anita flagged it immediately. "They're trying to lay groundwork for a retroactive easement claim," she warned. "This is how they move. Build procedural fog, then force compliance when people are too overwhelmed to untangle it." She requested a hearing to challenge the legitimacy of any easement filings, and Miles preemptively secured affidavits from the original landowners confirming no public access agreements had ever been signed. Still, the noise grew louder. Local chatter on message boards turned nasty. An anonymous post accused Miles of hoarding public land for private gain, and included a drone photo of his property. Fuzzy and grainy, but enough to show the barn, the fencing, and part of the herd. That photo wasn't taken from a legal altitude. It was surveillance, not curiosity. The real blow came the following weekend. Miles was hosting a visit from a conservation biologist he'd worked with years ago, a woman from the University of Arizona who had been instrumental in helping him design the rotational grazing model. They were standing near the eastern paddock discussing seasonal forage growth when a series of loud pops echoed through the valley, sharp, unnatural cracks that immediately startled the animals. Several of the bison jerked and wheeled, and one of the younger bulls slammed into a gate, splintering the top beam and buckling the frame. Miles and his guest ran to calm them, and eventually the animals settled, but the damage was done. The bull had suffered a deep cut along his flank, not life-threatening, but requiring stitches. Miles filed another report and this time insisted on a formal response. The deputy who showed up said they'd received multiple noise complaints from the adjacent community and attributed the sounds to some kids with firecrackers, but the biologist shook her head. "That wasn't recreational," she said quietly to Miles. "That was targeted. Those animals were startled deliberately." Karen, of course, denied everything. When contacted for comment by a small local journalist following up on the incident, she claimed she hadn't even been home that weekend. "I just want what's best for our community," she said. "We're all trying to coexist peacefully, but certain individuals seem determined to keep the land closed off." It was textbook deflection. But worse, it worked. Public opinion, never firmly on Miles's side to begin with, started to shift. People liked simple narratives, and Karen gave them one: stubborn landowner versus the collective good. Never mind that her interpretation of the collective excluded anyone who didn't share her narrow view of what a neighborhood should look like. Anita advised caution. "They're baiting you, Miles. They want you to lash out so they can paint you as unstable. Don't give them the image they're fishing for." But Miles wasn't angry. He was methodical. He repaired the gate, reinforced the outer perimeter with secondary fencing, and installed motion-triggered lighting near the barn and at both property entrances. He didn't say anything publicly. He didn't give interviews or post statements online. But he moved one of the larger bulls, Elmer, a broad, slow-moving behemoth with a gentle temperament, into a corral adjacent to the playground. Not as a threat, but as a presence. A reminder. The animal posed no danger. He stood peacefully in the shade, chewing cud and blinking at the world with the indifference of a creature too old to be bothered. Still, his proximity to the play area did not go unnoticed. Parents began complaining. Karen called the park's director and requested that a fence be installed to separate the playground from the livestock zone. The director declined, noting that the playground was fully contained within its own parcel, and that any barrier would have to be placed on private property, which Miles obviously wasn't going to allow. The standstill was symbolic but important. For the first time, Karen's influence didn't yield immediate results. That week, another anonymous complaint was filed. alleging that Miles's water troughs were drawing from a protected aquifer. The accusation was absurd. His system was closed-loop, fed by rain capture and regulated storage, but it triggered another inspection. This time, 2 inspectors arrived without notice, citing urgent environmental review. Miles let them in, watched as they poked around, and answered their questions calmly. By the end of the visit, one of them was visibly frustrated. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Everything's up to code." They left, and again, nothing came of it. But the effect was cumulative. Miles began to feel less like a landowner and more like a man being slowly encircled. He knew it wouldn't stop unless someone higher up stepped in, but that meant pushing the issue to a breaking point, and Miles wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, he adjusted. Adapted. He held a private meeting with Anita and a retired judge she'd worked with in previous land use cases. The judge reviewed the file, nodded grimly, and said, "They're not after your land. They're after your surrender. If they get you to concede once, just once, they'll claim you were in the wrong all along." Miles understood. He couldn't afford even a symbolic retreat. So he leaned into the one thing he knew better than Karen ever would: land. He submitted a proposal to the state's Ecological Pilot Program to designate part of his property as a conservation buffer zone. If approved, it would grant him additional protections and make it harder for adjacent properties to initiate development or zoning adjustments. It was a long process, but it was leverage. Quiet, legal, durable leverage. And he didn't need public sympathy to wield it. All he had to do was wait, because the more they pressed, the more they revealed themselves. And when the time came, Miles wouldn't need to raise his voice. The land would speak for him. The tipping point came not with a bang, but with an invitation. A carefully worded, professionally formatted letter slid under the gate, bearing the letterhead of the Community Advisory Liaison Board. It invited Miles to a facilitated dialogue session intended to foster mutual understanding and reduce tensions between property stakeholders and the surrounding community. Nowhere in the letter was there any admission of conflict, nor was Karen's name mentioned, but Miles didn't need it spelled out. It was her or someone working for her, trying to control the narrative. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a municipal annex room adjacent to the public library. The implication was clear: show up, sit quietly, and let them frame the situation as one of miscommunication instead of targeted harassment. Miles didn't decline. Instead, he attended, alone, without Anita, but fully prepared. The room was sterile and underlit, with long folding tables arranged in a horseshoe. Karen sat near the center, flanked by 2 men in sport jackets and a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as the session's facilitator. She smiled too much, spoke too gently, as if the conversation were about planning a bake sale, not addressing weeks of sabotage, false reports, and trespassing. They opened with pre-scripted statements reiterating their commitment to collaborative stewardship of shared green spaces. Then they asked Miles to speak. He didn't give a speech. He gave them facts. He cited the county plat lines, quoted legal boundaries, referenced the timestamps of agency visits, and described the injuries to his animals in precise clinical detail. He did not accuse. He simply recounted. And when he finished, there was silence, a full, heavy pause that no one wanted to break. Karen eventually leaned forward and said, in that steady voice she used when she was trying to sound reasonable, "We understand your passion for the land, but there needs to be give and take when you live near families and public areas. Compromise is how communities survive." Miles responded without raising his voice. "Compromise implies equal footing. You've trespassed, manipulated agencies, and endangered livestock. That's not dialogue. It's coercion wrapped in courtesy." The facilitator jumped in quickly, trying to diffuse. Let's redirect toward constructive pathways. What would help you feel safe, Mr. Kessler? He smiled, just slightly. Respect. And silence. The session ended without resolution, though the facilitator claimed it was a valuable first step. Miles left the building with no illusions. This wasn't a resolution effort. It was a trap to document his tone, hoping he'd lash out, say something legally actionable. But he hadn't. He'd been methodical, cold, unyielding, and it rattled them. Within days, another anonymous complaint appeared, this one to the Department of Agriculture, alleging improper manure disposal that could contaminate water runoff. An inspection was launched, but this time, Miles was ready. He provided logs, diagrams, and third-party verifications from the conservation biologist who had visited weeks earlier. The inspector barely stayed 20 minutes. He left with a copy of the documentation and a quiet apology. Someone's clearly targeting you. This isn't normal. That acknowledgement, even whispered, was fuel. It meant the cracks were beginning to show. But cracks weren't enough. What Miles needed was a wedge. That wedge came unexpectedly from within the association itself. A man named Gerald Wint, one of the board members listed on the association's website, contacted Anita through her office. He didn't want to speak publicly, but he sent a notarized statement via courier. In it, he explained that internal communications from Karen had discussed escalating strategic pressure on Miles, including coordination with certain agency contacts and real estate groups. She had allegedly pitched a redevelopment idea that involved converting the playground-adjacent corridor into a community learning and wellness trail, which would require extending public access across part of Miles's property or forcing him out. The memo attached to Gerald's statement included a rough outline of a walking route that cut directly through the area where his barn and grazing fields now stood. Anita took the affidavit and submitted it to the County Planning Commission along with a motion to enjoin any current or future zoning amendments affecting his property. The motion was accepted for preliminary review. It didn't stop anything yet, but it put every action under a microscope. Karen's maneuvering had gone from shadow play to spotlight, and bureaucrats hate light. That same week, Miles received a letter from the Conservation Grant Office. His proposal to designate a conservation buffer zone had passed the first round of approval. If finalized, it would create a 3-year freeze on non-agricultural development within 200 feet of the designated parcel, including the area directly bordering the community park. It was exactly the kind of leverage he'd hoped for. Quiet, official, untouchable. But Karen, true to form, didn't retreat. She changed tactics. The following Saturday, a family field day event was scheduled at the community park. Organized by the association, it included games, food trucks, and a junior nature ranger scavenger hunt. From a distance, it looked innocent. Kids with balloons, strollers rolling past food stands, music floating in the breeze. But Miles noticed a change. Signs had been added near the fence line. Temporary placards with phrases like, "Explore beyond the fence," and "Nature doesn't stop at boundaries." The scavenger hunt lists handed to children included items like buffalo tracks, barn noises, and unusual animals. It wasn't subtle. It was a staged incursion masked as family fun, with a built-in PR defense. We didn't tell them to trespass, they were just curious children. By late afternoon, several children had wandered up to the edge of the fence. One boy climbed onto a support beam to see over. Miles remained visible, sitting in a chair near the barn, observing. He didn't confront. He simply took photographs. When a woman approached the fence and shouted, "Are these safe?" While pointing at the animals, he stood, walked to the edge, and replied calmly, "Safer than the lies you were sold." She pulled the child away and vanished into the crowd. That evening, he sent the photos to Anita and began compiling a file for future use. Not yet for court, but for narrative control. Karen had taken the battle public. It was time to show who truly owned the ground beneath it. Miles didn't call the sheriff. He didn't demand arrests or fines. He let them have their picnic. But by morning, the fence line held something new. A laminated sign secured with metal ties that read, "Private Ecological Project Zone. Entry constitutes trespass. Animals monitored. Footage archived." They had made his land part of their story. Now he would make theirs part of his evidence. The morning the fence was clipped, Miles felt it before he saw it. The shift in tension among the herd was subtle but undeniable. The younger cows were clustered tightly near the south end of the enclosure, unusually still, and two of the bulls were pacing, snorting softly, heads twitching toward the northern edge of the paddock. Miles moved quietly through the tall grass, boots sinking slightly into the dewed earth until he reached the corner post. There, lying on the ground like a discarded thought, was the top strand of his perimeter fence, cut cleanly, deliberately, and dropped with the wire still curled as if the snippers had barely flinched. The wooden post beside it was charred, not fully burned, but blackened in a circular patch as though someone had tried to set a fire and then thought better of it. The marks were recent. He bent low, examined the disturbed soil, found a boot print not his own, then stood in silence, staring at the opening that now invited whatever dared to cross. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stepped back, retrieved his camera, and documented every angle, then called Anita. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm but alert. "Get it photographed. Call the county and lock the damn gate. I'll send someone to collect evidence." By mid-morning, a private investigator arrived, hired through Anita's firm. Not law enforcement, not a ranger, but a third-party specialist with a military buzz cut and a face that had seen too much and cared very little. He didn't speak much, just walked the perimeter, took his own photos, and lifted a cigarette from behind his ear without lighting it. When he finished, he handed Miles a sealed evidence bag and said, "This wasn't random. They're escalating because you didn't fold. Someone's panicking." Miles nodded, though he didn't say it out loud. He already knew that. The only thing left uncertain was how far they were willing to go. 2 nights later, the herd broke containment. Not entirely, not dangerously, but enough. A gap in the fence, barely visible from the road, had been forced wider. One of the heifers, young and spry, slipped through first, followed by 2 males and a calf. They didn't run. They grazed, methodical, calm, and entirely unaware that their presence beyond the fence line would trigger the kind of response Miles had been dreading for weeks. The first call came from a parent, someone walking near the park who claimed the bison were charging the swing set. They weren't. They were 50 yards away, heads down in the clover. But panic has a way of rewriting facts before they're written at all. By the time the first cruiser pulled up, there were 6 calls logged, each more hysterical than the last. Miles was already there, ushering the animals back with quiet commands and practiced hand movements. No shouts, no whistles, just subtle cues and low clucks of the tongue. The bison responded, slowly turning back toward the enclosure with the calm of creatures used to following routine. Still, the officers arrived with hands near weapons, tense and uncertain. "Sir, we've had reports of aggressive livestock," one officer began, but Miles cut him off. "They're back inside. No aggression, no damage, no contact." He gestured toward the herd, now milling lazily behind the newly closed gate. The officer didn't lower his posture. "We'll still need to file an incident report. There are concerns about public safety." Miles didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just handed the officer a printout. Fence diagrams, timestamps from his camera footage, and a copy of the emergency inspection waiver he'd registered after the previous sabotage attempt. "You'll also want to review this," he said, voice flat. "The opening wasn't created by the animals." By dawn, the report had been filed, and by noon, the local paper ran a headline: "Buffalo on the Loose. Community Tensions Rise." It was a half-truth masquerading as coverage, featuring an anonymous quote from a concerned board member who claimed the animals were a disaster waiting to happen. Miles didn't respond, but that evening the sign on the northern edge of his land changed. Where once it read, "Private Ecological Zone," it now bore a new addition: "Livestock Legally Monitored." Crossing this line constitutes trespass. Surveillance footage archived. County notified upon entry. The message was no longer just about property. It was a warning wrapped in civility, the kind that lands hard when spoken without anger. Karen didn't speak to him directly, but her moves were obvious. The next week, she organized what she called a safety forum, inviting local parents, association members, and representatives from the city council to discuss the growing threat of unmanaged agricultural expansion. No names were listed, but the flyers posted around town all featured the same photo, a slightly blurred image of a bison grazing, with the playground visible in the background. Fear by implication, panic by suggestion. At the forum, Karen spoke for 15 minutes uninterrupted. She cited near misses, animal containment failures, and the potential for irreversible environmental conflict. Her words were careful, almost rehearsed. Miles wasn't invited, of course, but a recording surfaced 2 days later, leaked by someone who had grown tired of her theater. Anita received it via encrypted message. The voice on the recording was clear, measured, but damning. Karen, speaking to another board member off mic, said, "We don't need a full incident, just something that tips it. One more complaint and the county will be forced to act." With that, the playbook became visible. Anita filed a motion to obtain an injunction against any coordinated attempts to alter the land use designation or force forced inspections without verified cause. It was a long shot. Courts hated intervening in local disputes, but it was enough to buy time. In parallel, she filed a tort notice, preserving Miles' right to sue the association and Karen individually for damages related to harassment, trespass, and reputational harm. It wasn't war, not officially, but the front lines had been drawn. Miles, meanwhile, focused on the land. He expanded the interior enclosure, moving the herd deeper into the back field, away from the visibility of the park. It wasn't retreat, it was preparation. He installed an underground water line with an insulated pump system, eliminating the need for exposed troughs near the perimeter. He stopped using exterior lighting, replaced it with infrared sensors tied to a private security server, and started logging every motion-triggered event. Not for defense, for the record, because when the next incident came, and it would, he intended to be ready. And it did come, not with fireworks or sabotage, but with subtlety. A guest speaker at a local council meeting presented data on animal-related injuries in mixed-use neighborhoods, using charts that included several fabricated metrics. One statistic claimed that unsecured livestock near community play areas increases childhood anxiety responses by 37%. The number was entirely fictional, sourced from a non-existent study. But it appeared official, and no one questioned it. Until Miles did. He filed a formal ethics complaint against the presenter, attaching a point-by-point breakdown of every manipulated figure. Within a week, the council was forced to issue a clarification. The speaker was disavowed. Karen's influence began to slip, but not disappear. In response, she pushed harder. A motion was introduced to rezone the land adjacent to the park as a wildlife safety buffer zone, a classification that, if passed, would restrict any agricultural activity within 50 feet of the shared boundary. It was a tactical masterstroke, one that bypassed direct confrontation and framed the conflict as one of civic duty. But Miles had already countered. The conservation buffer he'd applied for had been approved in full just days before, and the new zoning motion conflicted with that designation. The council was legally barred from voting until the overlap was resolved. A temporary victory, but a critical one. The tide had shifted. And then, in a final gesture of quiet defiance, Miles did the one thing no one expected. He opened the observation field. Not to the public, not to the board, but to a select list of conservation students and ecological researchers. He built a raised viewing platform set well within his land, invited credentialed observers, and posted the legal parameters of the initiative. From there, visitors could watch the herd in silence, study their behaviors, and understand the balance Miles had spent years creating. It was not a zoo. It was not a protest. It was a demonstration of what land could be when left in the hands of someone who respected it. Karen's camp tried to spin it as a PR stunt, but the narrative no longer held. The students wrote about their visits. The researchers published observations. And the county, finally, took notice not of the noise, but of the evidence. Real data, real outcomes, real stewardship. Miles never raised his voice. He never filed a lawsuit, or picketed a meeting, or published a blog. He stood his ground, tended his land, and outlasted the storm. And when the wind finally began to shift, when the pressure eased and the silence returned, he didn't celebrate. He simply looked out over the field, watched the slow grazing movements of the herd, and waited for the next move that would never come. The moment it all cracked began not with an act of aggression, but with an invitation. Not from Karen, nor the board, nor any official channel, but from the local elementary school. Unsigned and informal, a hand-delivered envelope with "To Mr. Kessler," written in pencil on the front. Inside, a crumpled drawing of a bison, thick and awkwardly shaped, colored with brown marker and labeled Buffalo Number 1, accompanied by a note scrawled in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for letting us see your animals. I liked the big one that stared at me." Miles stood in his kitchen for a long time after reading it, the note trembling slightly in his hand, not from sentiment but from the weight of what it represented. Someone, a teacher most likely, had bypassed the growing wall of suspicion and tension and sent children to observe, learn, and appreciate what had been vilified for months. It was small, maybe even naive, but it was the first genuine gesture he had received in a long time that didn't come dressed in bureaucracy or malice. He placed the drawing on the fridge and stared at it for a long time before going out into the field, where the air was warm and the bison were silent and unbothered. But Karen had not paused in her campaign. In fact, the momentary shift in public interest toward Miles's favor seemed to spur her forward with greater urgency. The next maneuver arrived swiftly and without preamble. A registered notice from a private civil firm hired by the association, asserting that continued neglect to adhere to community safety standards would result in a suit for public endangerment and property devaluation. The letter was bloated with vague terminology and footnoted ordinances that had nothing to do with agricultural land use, all designed to sound credible to someone who might not know better. But Anita knew better. She tore it apart in less than an hour, issuing a counter-notice demanding immediate retraction and threatening a defamation suit if the statement was not withdrawn. It wasn't about the letter anymore. It was about public theater. Karen wasn't expecting compliance. She was counting on public confusion and administrative fatigue. But Miles' side wasn't exhausted. They were sharpening. The final escalation happened at dusk, as so many things do when people hope to act unseen. Miles was walking the southern edge of the field, making a final pass before turning in for the night. The animals were quiet. The light was low, and then came the sound. Metal clanging once, then twice, followed by the unmistakable squeal of chain links under tension. He turned toward the north fence and began to run. By the time he reached the fence line, 2 teenagers had already slipped through, stumbling over the fresh-cut wire, laughing and shouting back toward the playground. Behind them, a third figure stood with a phone raised, recording, narrating the trespass in an exaggerated, gleeful voice. "Here we are, folks, buffalo up close. Wild, freakin' nature, brought to you by the stubborn old guy who won't share." The laughter was cut short when one of the younger bulls, startled by the commotion, began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, head low and body stiff, with alarm. Miles didn't shout. He didn't run. He stepped directly into the field, placed himself between the bison and the kids, and raised his arms wide in a slow, controlled motion. The animal hesitated, then backed off, confused but no longer agitated. The kids froze. The one holding the phone whispered, "Shit," under his breath. Miles didn't speak until the bison had turned away. Then, with his voice like iron stretched thin, he said, "Move. Now." The boys didn't argue. They climbed back through the gap and took off across the park, vanishing into the growing dark. Miles repaired the opening with temporary ties and stood motionless until the moon crested the tree line. By morning, the video had surfaced online. It wasn't the full event, just the part where the bison had moved forward, coupled with the screaming and the scramble. The voice in the video labeled Miles as the man who let the buffalo loose. It spread. Local message boards lit up. Parents demanded action. City officials received emails by the dozen. The council scheduled an emergency meeting. Karen requested a special session with the county administrator. Miles watched it unfold, not with anger, but with clarity. It was the moment she had been engineering all along, the evidence she'd been craving. But it wasn't hers anymore. Anita stepped in quickly. They released a statement through her office attaching the footage from Miles's own security system, high resolution, time-stamped, showing the trespass, the vandalism, the precise moment the teens entered the field, and the exact placement of the bison before Miles intervened. They didn't embellish. They didn't dramatize. They simply released the truth. The shift was immediate. Public support wobbled, then snapped back. The sheriff's department confirmed that an investigation was underway and that charges of trespassing and reckless endangerment were being considered. Karen's name was not mentioned in the reports, but her fingerprints were everywhere. That same day, the county announced a pause on all discussions related to zoning reclassification and public access in Miles's area. They cited inconsistent procedural submissions and potential undue influence by non-municipal advisory bodies. The phrasing was dry, but the meaning was clear. Karen's reach had finally overextended. Her credibility had collapsed under the weight of her own tactics. Within a week, 2 members of the association board resigned, citing a loss of confidence in leadership. A third issued a public apology on a community forum, stating they had been pressured into compliance and no longer supported the agenda. Being pushed, Karen herself didn't resign. She didn't release a statement. She simply stopped appearing in public. Her name became synonymous not with stewardship or community engagement, but with manipulation and overreach. The town moved on. The county resumed normal operations. Miles, as always, remained quiet. He didn't seek a formal victory, didn't sue, didn't publish a triumphant letter. He simply went back to the land, to the slow rhythm of days and the quiet breath of animals moving through grass. He rebuilt the fence line one final time, this time not with wood or wire, but with living hedgerows, dense native shrubs that would grow strong and rooted, barriers not easily severed. They would take time, years even, to mature, but that was the point. Some boundaries were meant to endure longer than arguments or headlines or temporary positions on a neighborhood board, and when the bison grazed near that line, undisturbed and unhurried, Miles would sometimes glance toward the park and the empty bench where Karen had once stood, arms folded, watching. He never spoke of her again. He didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything she had ever said. The change didn't come with a proclamation or a vote or some televised announcement. It arrived in the subtle shift of daily routines, in the way silence replaced tension, and how people who had once looked at Miles's land with suspicion now simply didn't look at all. The playground remained, of course, but its edge stayed clear. The children still played, but none wandered past the boundary. No more parents stood at the fence pretending concern. No more whispers carried from walking paths. Karen's bench near the trailhead, once a kind of watchtower for her quiet authority, sat empty for weeks, then was removed entirely by city workers under the pretense of park maintenance. No one replaced it. No one asked why. The people who had taken her cues now took theirs from absence, and in that absence, the land began to breathe again. Miles didn't mark the turning point with ceremony. He marked it the way he did everything else, with work. He finished the hedgerow, anchoring the final segment with a new planting of mountain mahogany that would thicken over time and create a living barrier impossible to cut without consequence. The bison were settled now, their patterns consistent, their presence no longer a novelty but a fixture. Local schools began to request structured visits. Small groups, carefully organized, supervised by actual educators, not social opportunists. Miles allowed it, quietly, without fanfare. The children came with wide eyes and notebooks, asking questions about horns and grazing and why the animals moved so slowly when they weren't afraid. He answered every question with the same patience he used to repair fences. And sometimes the children left drawings, folded notes, or hand-painted signs thanking him for letting them see real nature. The county granted full confirmation of the conservation buffer zone 3 weeks after the final incident. The designation came with a series of protective clauses that would outlast any future board member or attempted rezoning motion. It formalized what had always been true but never been acknowledged, that the land had value not because of what could be built on it, but because of what had been protected from it. Miles didn't speak at the confirmation hearing. Anita did, standing with her hands folded before a simple statement of facts, none of them dramatized. She said only that property owners have the right to defend their land from manipulation, and that silence does not imply consent, nor does independence suggest negligence. When she stepped down, the room was quiet. No questions, no rebuttals. The record stood unchallenged. Karen Wilmore was never formally censured, never sued, never publicly disgraced beyond whispers and social exile. But her house went up for sale not long after the hearing, listed quietly with an out-of-town broker, and within a month she was gone. No goodbye, no notice, just an absence where once there had been scrutiny. The new owners of her home never mentioned her. They waved politely to Miles across the road when they passed, but kept their distance, content to let the land define its own borders. For Miles, the end wasn't vindication. It wasn't even relief. It was stillness. A slow return to the life he had tried to build from the beginning. A life where things grew at their own pace, where boundaries held not because they were enforced, but because they were understood. He rebuilt the northern gate one final time, not as a point of entry but as a piece of permanence. Heavy timber, raw and untreated, with iron brackets forged by hand. He carved no names, made no inscriptions, but on the underside of the gate, hidden from view unless one knew to look, he burned a single word with a soldering iron. Enough. In the evenings he would walk the perimeter and check each post, each growth line of the new hedge, each trace of animal movement. Sometimes Elmer, the old bull, would trail behind, slow and quiet as ever, stopping only when Miles stopped, standing sentinel beside him. And in those moments, looking out over the open range and the long grass swaying in the breeze, Miles didn't feel victorious. He felt resolved, not because the battle had ended, but because he'd refused to fight it on someone else's terms, because he had chosen the hard way, the slow way, the way that held. He never spoke of Karen again. Not to Anita, not to the neighbors, not even to the children who asked about the new signs. He didn't need to. The land had recorded everything, quietly, permanently, without exaggeration or omission, and in the end, that was all the truth he required.